Welcome to a very brief historical tour of the library catalog. My name is Elisa C. In this module, we will look at the development of library catalogs, one of the foundational technologies of librarianship. To be more exact, we will be looking at selected milestones along the evolution of cataloging practices and standards. What is a catalog? A catalog should ideally provide an inventory, represent a collection and each item held within it, and enable specific tasks such as finding, identifying, searching, and obtaining information. Good cataloging records form the foundation of bibliographic discovery and access, whether that bibliographic information is for research, learning, professional development, personal curiosity, or leisure. Having said this, what is a bibliographic record? It is a representation of a specific thing found in a collection. Its description enables us to anticipate the resource so that even before we arrive at the library or walk up to the shelf, we know what we are looking for. Finally, a good bibliographic record also indicates possible relationships that this thing in the collection has with other things in the collection that may potentially interest us and other users. So, if we know what a bibliographic record is, how do we approach the creation of a bibliographic record and ultimately a catalog of them? This activity can be harder to achieve than it appears on the surface. Just consider what Thomas Hyde had to say regarding the establishment of the Bodleian Library Catalog in 1674. With characteristic bad judgment, they regarded a pleasant enough task to devote 1 or maybe 2 weeks to producing an index of a few books. They hardly consider the tedium involved in inspecting and setting down alphabetically a myriad of books. But besides that distasteful labor, which sapped too much strength of body and spirit, one could expect to encounter in so extensive a work, where books of all kinds were gathered from different nations of the world, a great many tangles and difficulties that also could torture the mind. The earliest known examples of inventories date back as far as 7th century Mesopotamia. Fragments of clay tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal are believed to contain shelf lists. Archaeologists also believe that in ancient Rome, public and private libraries often held classified and bibliographic lists of works held in collections. The first national cataloging code appeared in revolutionary France in 1791. The government, having appropriated all ecclesiastical properties, including vast church library collections, needed to know what properties it owned. It wanted to generate a national bibliography in order to make decisions on how to use these newly nationalized resources. A cataloging code became necessary because most people working on the national bibliography had no prior experience. The code offered guidelines on description as well as shelf location markings. The bibliographers also created a primitive card catalog as part of their process. These cards were used for sorting rather than for actual search and retrieval. The cards themselves consisted of brief records written on the blank backs of playing cards. With each card representing individual records, those preparing the bibliography could quickly sort records in alphabetical order. The earliest articulation of cataloging rules came from those tasked with organizing large library collections. A classic example of this is Antonio Panizzi's Rules for the Compilation of the Catalogue of the British Museum Library, published in 1841. Later, this collection formed the basis for the British Library. Panizzi's rules are outlined in the preface of the first and only volume of his book catalogue of the British Museum's library collection. It codified the best practices at the time, with some practices dating back as far as the catalogues of medieval monasteries. His catalogue was hierarchical in structure, with works arranged alphabetically by title, author, surname, what would later be called main entry. Panizzi also used cross-references to indicate relationships between works and secondary authors. He provided instructions on how to enter names, such as proper names, names of monarchs and the nobility, Jewish rabbis, families, and corporate bodies. He provided instructions on how to record titles of books, including spelling, variations in titles across different parts of a book, the Bible, and numbering peculiarities. He dealt with anonymous and pseudonymous works, collective works, laws, translations, and non-English languages, including German, Hebrew, and what he deemed as quote-unquote Oriental characters and languages. A scan of Panizzi's catalog is available open access through Google Books. If you take a look at a couple of author name entries that Panizzi constructed, such as on page 423 of the catalog, you will notice that entries are arranged by author name in alphabetical order, with the titles of each of their works listed underneath their names. Let's take a look at the entries for Audubon and Audran. Under the entry for Audubon, John James, we can see that the British Museum Library had one work by this author. You can see this from the single title entry. Aside from the very long title of this work, we can see that the library owned volumes 1 to 4 of this work. We can also see that this work was not the same work as The Birds of America, although it is likely a related work. Panizzi also recorded the location and the date of publication, Edinburgh, 1831 to 1838, as well as an approximate physical description, octavo. Let's look at the entry for Audran Yves-Marie. We see an indentation with a C reference to another author, whose last name sounded like this author's last name. We see titles of the different works, with their English translation appearing in square brackets. The location and date of publication were recorded in square brackets with question marks, where information has been deduced by the cataloger. The note, another copy, was used to indicate that more than one copy was held in the collection. As you may have noticed, both of the Audubon and the Audran author entries are extremely concise. They provide little to no information about the content of the works. These alphabetical entries, published within a print volume, are an example of a dictionary catalog. A natural question that arises from the publication of dictionary catalogs is, what happens when new books are added or corrections need to be made? Charles Coffin Jewett, librarian at the Smithsonian, was another instrumental figure in the development of library cataloging. Like Panizzi, he found himself having to explain to a non-library audience why cataloging rules and standards were important. In his 1853 report for the Smithsonian, he advocated for a stereotyping process that would allow records to be efficiently duplicated using movable plates. What he envisioned was a precursor to copy cataloging, from which we have now derived many services, such as cooperative cataloging and interlibrary loan. Jewett was a proponent of uniformity and standardization of catalog records. He believed that rules needed to be established and followed for the sake of improving the efficiency of cataloging, even if it sometimes meant establishing rules that were hard for an untrained member of the general public to understand. Jewett further advocated for the creation of a national library, ideally to be based within the Smithsonian. He felt that it was important to maintain a national cataloging service that would contribute records to a universal catalog. He also envisioned a national book deposit where a copy of every American book published would be kept. Jewett articulated the importance of representation, in other words, transcription, as a principle of descriptive cataloging. Charles M. E. Cutter, librarian at Harvard, then later at the Boston Athenaeum, published his influential Rules for a Dictionary Catalog 4th edition in 1906. In his rules, Cutter acknowledges the work of previous catalogers, including Panizzi and Jewett, and builds on existing traditions by framing them as principles, and then articulating the rules and practices in a systematic way. The 4th edition of Cutter's Rules came out at a time when many libraries had already adopted the card catalog, and the Library of Congress had already begun to issue catalog cards as part of its cataloging service. Cutter states that, quote, "The convenience of the public is always to be set before the ease of the cataloger," end quote. In Cutter's rules, there are three main objects to a library catalog. 1. To help users find the work that they need. 2. To collocate like works. And 3. To assist users in choosing the exact work that they want. In order to achieve these three objects, Cutter outlines 5 possible means. 1. Through author entries. 2. Through title entries. 3. Through subject entries. 4. Through form and language entries. And 5. By way of description about additions, imprints, and other identifying notes. In 1946, Seymour Lubetsky was charged by the Library of Congress to simplify the rules of cataloging by distilling practices and rules down to the principles that focus on the functions of catalogs. Some principles covered by Lubetsky include, firstly, the terms of description. This is the idea that catalogers must take what they see, transcribe whenever possible, and provide explanations where necessary. The collation should focus only on information that holds special bibliographical significance. Secondly, extent of description was important. Lubetsky stated that catalogers ought to describe as fully as necessary, but with an economy of data. Thirdly, he emphasized the importance of the organization of the elements of description. There is a generally accepted order to the information represented in a catalog record. For instance, title and author information appear before the edition statements, place, publisher, and data publication, series notes, and supplementary notes. The International Conference on Cataloging Principles, or the Paris Conference, was held in 1961 as the first attempt to standardize disparate cataloging practices in North America, the United Kingdom, and Europe. The Paris Principles, as they came to be known, addressed the following aspects of cataloging: the functions of the catalog, the structure of the catalog, kinds of entry, multiple entries, uniform headings, entry under corporate bodies, multiple authorship, and serials. Was this conference truly international? As Carpenter points out in Foundations of Cataloging, in order for one set of principles to be developed, the participating committees had to make compromises, permitting certain local practices to continue. With over 4 decades of changes in the structure of library catalogs and how users go about finding information, namely through the introduction of the online public access catalog, the International Federation of Library Associations, otherwise known as IFLA, came together to update the Paris Principles. In 2009, this update was published as the Statement of International Cataloging Principles. By building upon cataloging traditions and on the newly published conceptual model, the Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records, or FRBR, the statement acknowledged existing practices while also looking forward, allowing for the principles to transcend the limitations of current cataloging platforms. The principles covered by the statement included 1. The convenience of the user, 2. Common usage, 3. Representation, 4. Accuracy, 5. Sufficiency and necessity, 6. Significance, 7. Consistency and standardization, and 8. Integration, namely the work towards a common set of rules for all types of materials. The international statement further includes the following point, quote, "The rules in a cataloging code should be defensible and not arbitrary. It is recognized that these principles may contradict each other in specific situations, and a defensible, practical solution should be taken," end quote. Around the same time that the IFLA Statement of International Cataloging Principles was finalized, work on the consolidated edition of the International Standard Bibliographic Description, otherwise known as ISBD, began to wrap up. The purpose of ISBD has been to promote universal bibliographic control and sharing of data through consistent recording of bibliographic information. If you were to look at various standards such as the Anglo-American Cataloging Rules or RDA Resource Description and Access, these often reference ISBD in its various stages of development. What are some advantages of universal bibliographic control? As Tillett pointed out in 2004 in her paper entitled Cataloging for the Future, universal bibliographic control enables cooperative cataloging, which takes advantage of the economies of scale yielded by mass-produced publications. It also allows flexibility for future uses of bibliographic and authority data across a multitude of systems. Universal bibliographic control is a step towards interoperability. It encourages data generation from other bibliographic partners, for instance, publishers. And finally, it allows for the integration with new technologies into the field of bibliographic work. The development of cataloging standards and practices is inextricably tied to technological milestones in libraries. The first of these was the creation of the card catalog in 1861 by Ezra Abbott, assistant librarian of Harvard College. The card catalog was an improvement on the dictionary catalog printed in book volumes because updates could be made more quickly without having to reprint entire bound volumes. Cards were then interfiled alphabetically by what was called the main entry. Usually this was the primary author, sometimes the title. The cards would be stored within drawers of a specially designed cabinet. More elaborate card catalogs might have separate cabinets for main entries, titles, perhaps secondary authors and subjects, as well as a separate shelf list, which would place cards in call number order to reflect the order of the books on the library's shelves. Because of limited space on the card, records tended to be as concise as possible. Take a look at the card on this slide. See if you can find the call number, main entry under corporate body, title, publication information and date, extent, topical subject headings, and form heading. Remember Charles Coffin Jewett and his dream of having the Smithsonian create and stereotype catalog records for distribution to other libraries? Although Jewett's ambition for the Smithsonian never came to fruition, in 1901, the Librarian of Congress, Herbert Putnam, announced that the Library of Congress was going to start selling copies of its catalog cards to other libraries in an effort to help save other libraries time. This essentially launched the Library of Congress as the national cataloging service in the United States. In trying to keep up with the volume of new books added to its collection, the Library of Congress looked for ways to automate the distribution of its catalog records. In the 1960s, systems analyst Henrietta Avram was engaged by the Library of Congress to lead the pilot project that would seek to make bibliographic records machine-readable. This came to be known as Machine-Readable Cataloging, or MARC. Participating institutions in the first phase of the pilot included Harvard, Yale, UCLA, and the University of Toronto. The purpose was to convert the Library of Congress's catalog cards into MARC format that could then be shared with other libraries as data files. Other libraries would then use those data files to reproduce their own catalog cards. About 58,000 card records were converted into MARC during this project. Eventually, as technology evolved, so did MARC, so that instead of using MARC today for reproducing catalog cards, it is the format for encoding our bibliographic records within OPACs, or our online public access catalogs. Widespread adoption of MARC served as a catalyst for libraries to experiment with making bibliographic records searchable and accessible using emerging computer and database technology. In the 1980s, as integrated library systems were developed, libraries looked towards computer science for ideas on how to develop OPACs. Libraries saw OPACs as a faster and more cost-efficient way to make catalog records available to users, as it cut out the time that would normally have been involved in creating cards for new records or updating and sorting cards related to an existing record. Libraries began to work with computer scientists and developers of commercial information retrieval systems as a model for structuring their online catalogs. The advent of the World Wide Web further aided this evolution. OCLC, for instance, maintains WorldCat, the largest union catalog online today, listing holdings from participating libraries around the world. Records are free to look up on the public interface of WorldCat, though not free to download. Through a Z3950 standard client server, subscribing libraries can download OCLC's MARC records into their own library databases. Library of Congress MARC records, in contrast, are free for libraries to download, but Library of Congress records reflect Library of Congress's holdings. This has been a quick tour through the history of library cataloging. Don't forget to review the course material distributed in Class 1 and through Quirkus in preparation for the next class.